So a friend asked me if I was reading anything good, and I was. I was reading The Forgetting Moon by Brian Lee Durfee. And well, my answer was, yeah, I'm reading this great book. It's the first book in this epic fantasy trilogy. And she interrupted me and said, what's epic fantasy? And I thought, hey, that'd be a pretty good video topic. So I'm going to talk about what is epic fantasy while reviewing The Forgetting Moon by Brian Lee Durfee, a book that I think you should read. So I don't know if there's a textbook definition of epic fantasy. I didn't look for a Wikipedia page or anything like that. But when I thought about what to me makes a work of epic fantasy like this one, I identified kind of 4 traits. So I'm going to talk about those and contrast it with a couple other book series and then give you some more thoughts about this book. The first trait is obviously the word epic. It has to be big. And when I say big, page count. I mean, look at this chunker. This is the shortest book in this series, and this is about 800 pages, so that certainly qualifies for epic. You think about, you can see up here, Wheel of Time, 15 big chunky books. Malazan Book of the Fallen, 10 big chunky books. That's epic fantasy. I think that's one trait, is it has to have a pretty good page count. So second point in dealing with this epic fantasy, I think it has to be a big scope. So the world itself or the story that's within the world has to have big ramifications. If you think of Malazan Book of the Fallen, that takes place on several continents on a world. In Brian Lee Durfee's book, in The Forgetting Moon, we're introduced to the 5 Isles. And I'm not sure if it's 5 continents or just one continent that has kind of 5 big islands, but it is a big scope of a story. Even though we're on Golconda, which is one of the isles for the bulk of the story, what is happening is you have kind of a religious conquest where one of the isles is trying to conquer all of the other ones, and we're on Golconda waiting for this invasion force to happen. So this is a story that's very big, and I would suspect, I don't know because I haven't read the next 2 books yet, but I would suspect we're probably going to see some action on some of the other isles. But even within this story, within this isle, there's several different point of views going on. There's a lot of storylines going on in different parts of the continent. So the third thing that I think an epic fantasy has to have is a large cast of characters and a sizable cast of point of view characters. Now, some may push back on this one because there probably are some epic fantasies that have a small number of point of view characters, but I think it's kind of inherent in this genre for that to be the case. If you think of A Song of Ice and Fire, you think of all the characters that George R.R. Martin created, and every chapter is a different point of view character. Wheel of Time has so many characters that there's even an app that you put in what book you're reading, and you can look up a character and it'll give you spoiler-free, up to that point who that character is, because there's thousands of characters. Well, there are certainly a lot of characters in this series. In this book so far, there's a cast of characters at the end of the book that's 7 pages long. And we get 7 or 8 point of views, and this certainly qualifies for epic with that amount of characters. But one thing I will say, I mean, I mentioned the Wheel of Time app, which I did have to start using at about book 7 because characters would disappear for a while and come back and I couldn't remember them. I will say in this book, I never had any confusion about any of the characters, including a lot of the side characters. I thought that Durfee did a great job at just very distinctly portraying a lot of these characters so that they were distinct, they were unique, and I was able to tell them apart very clearly. And there wasn't a single time in this book that I felt that a character was on screen that I didn't know who they were. So I think he did a very good job juggling a lot of these characters. And I'll talk about point of views a little bit when I talk about plotting and pacing of this book, because that is something that I think Durfee did really well in this book as well. All right, my fourth point of answering this question, what is epic fantasy, I think is one that's a little bit more subjective. But for me, a work of epic fantasy has to have historical depth in the world building. For me, the world building is such an important part to epic fantasy that you need to feel like this is a real place, that there's a deep history and there's deep lore. If you think about those series that I've already mentioned in the other the other bullet points of this video. Song of Ice and Fire, Malazan Book of the Fallen, Wheel of Time, kind of my three prime examples of what is epic fantasy. There's so much depth of the world building and history and lore, and Durfee does that very well here, and he does it a very interesting way. So the way that you get a lot of world building in here is through his use of epigraphs. Those little paragraphs that happen right before a chapter begins. And a lot of times in this book, it's from some sort of historical text. And what it does is it provides some world building, it provides some historical background. A lot of times it's from different kind of texts, so you often get different perspectives of things that are going on. And I think, frankly, it's just an artful way of delivering some exposition to help you along with the story without giving you one of those blatant exposition dumps that we often complain about when we're reading stories of this type. So I think that's something Durfee did really well, and it just reinforced the fact to me that, yes, this is a work of epic fantasy. So let's talk more about this book, because that is the first thing that struck me when I was reading this. I was reading this and I said, you know, it's been a while since I've really read true epic fantasy. And it's one of those that I was so glad to be back in this kind of story, because it's been a while. So let's talk about some of the elements that I really liked about this book, because the likes definitely outweigh the dislikes. I mentioned at the outset that I think this is a book that you should read. I think given the quality of what I've seen with the first book, the reception of people, what they've talked about, how the series gets better and better, and I contrast that with like the GOODREADS numbers of reviews, not enough people are reading this book. So hopefully this video will help get a few eyes on this book. The first thing that I really enjoyed about this book is it's a modern fantasy tale that is not afraid to embrace both classic fantasy archetypes as well as classic fantasy races. I think too often modern fantasy writers want to feel modern, they want to feel new and novel, and they dismiss everything, and they try to make everything feel new and novel, and it may be true, but it just doesn't work as well, at least for this reader. I liked the way that he embraced a lot of the archetypes. You get a lot of the traditional fantasy archetypes, like you got the orphan farm boy, not really a farm boy here, but that kind of character who may be a chosen one. You get an enigmatic mentor figure that you don't know his motivations or much about him. In fact, the reader may know more about him than his mentee. You get a princess who wants to be a warrior. I mean, you get so many of these archetypes. And I think even though it's done differently, where Durfee changes the way that he writes these characters, just having kind of that grounding, I think is a positive thing. I think modern authors sometimes try too hard to just make everything new. And because of that, there's almost a sense of detachment from the reader, at least from this one. So I like that he embraced that. Additionally, he embraces kind of the traditional races, even though he names a couple differently. There are elves and dwarves and orcs here, and the orcs and elves have kind of different names, but even that bit of familiarity, I think, just lends a level of comfort to someone who's used to this genre. People always bemoan the fact that, oh, tropes, 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 tropes. Well, the tropes are what make a work part of a genre. I read crime fiction. There are mystery and crime fiction tropes, and you don't just dismiss them. You just maybe embrace them and do them your own way. And I like how Durfee did that so very well in this book. Another thing I alluded to earlier was the plotting and pacing of this book. One thing I really liked was how he balanced the point of views. But when I say balanced, it was at equal time. I've seen some authors do this and try to make it equal, and it doesn't work. They'll have POV A, B, C, and they'll kind of roll through it that way. And yes, it'll balance the storylines, but a lot of times some of the storylines are not as interesting. And one thing I thought Durfee did very well in this book is the fact that when a storyline was more important and more interesting, he just stuck with it for a while until it came to a logical conclusion, and then he moved to the next point of view. So you might follow one point of view for 3 or 4 chapters. Then the next chapter might be one point of view, and then you may go somewhere else. And I thought it balanced the book very well, and in many ways it helped just the pace of the book feel very fast. I mean, this is a huge, chunky book. Look at this thing. This read fast. This read really fast for a book of this size, and part of it was because I thought the plotting and pacing was so well done. There was only one time that I thought it slowed down. There's kind of a journey in the middle of this book, a little past the halfway point, that I felt went on just a little too long. But besides that moment, I thought the plotting and pacing was so well done, and I think that's so important in a big chunky book like this. One other thing on that topic that I enjoyed is kind of the chapter length. The chapter lengths earlier in the book were a lot longer, and it gave you time to kind of learn the characters and get your footing in the world. And then later in the book, as the action started to speed up, the chapters got shorter and shorter, and I think that helped the momentum, especially in the last third of the book as well. You got a good solid footing in the very beginning of this book into these characters in this world and what was going on with this religious conquest. And then towards the end of the book, you just kind of things sped up as you got to the conclusion of this. So I thought that was very, very well done. Another point that goes kind of along with plotting and world building is I mentioned how the epigraphs were kind of like mini info dumps. One thing that I was very impressed with in this book was there are some info dumps, but it seemed like the author knew exactly when to give them to you. In fact, I kind of made a note, and it was almost in intervals of about 170, 180 pages, there would be an info dump chapter. And I felt on the first one it was perfect timing, because at that point in the book, there were several things going on where you as a reader, you had questions, you wanted to find some answers out, and the characters in the story wanted to find some answers out. So it was just like the perfect timing to have a chapter with some info dumping. And then you didn't have another one for like another 180 pages or something like that. And it felt like it was just very well done how this happened. We often don't like info dumps, but I felt like he saved them for the moment where you as a reader needed them most. And I really appreciated that aspect of the story, so that when I got to those info dumps, I wasn't dismissive of them. I wasn't bemoaning the fact, oh, here's an info dump. I kind of wanted them at that point. I thought that was very well done, and I don't know if many authors have done it that way before. So that was definitely a point in the favor of this book. I want to talk about character a little bit. So there are a lot of characters in here, and I mentioned how distinct they are. And that was something that was very well done. And I did like the characters in here. They're pretty vivid. I think they're very well drawn. You can picture them. You can understand a lot of them. But what I like is that some of the secondary characters in particular, you're not sure their motivations throughout the book. Some of them are revealed. Some of them you're still waiting for book 2 to figure out what's going on. And I found those the most interesting characters. And it's not the typical stereotypical modern fantasy, all shades of gray. It's just a matter of knowing, what is this person? Why are they doing this? Are they thinking along these lines? Are they thinking along these lines? And there's so many questions about their motivations, and I really enjoyed that aspect of it. One small thing I will say, though, that I didn't emotionally connect with any of these characters. Maybe I will later in the series. In fact, there's one character that goes through, let's just say, something traumatic, kind of big in this book, that I didn't really feel anything, and I felt that I probably should have felt something. Part of it may have been the fact that I kind of saw coming what was going to happen to this character. So maybe because it wasn't a shock, it didn't hit me emotionally. That would be my only minor complaint about the characterization here, is I didn't really connect emotionally with them. But perhaps this is something that in subsequent volumes, as I live with these characters more, I will start to connect with them quite a bit more. One last thing I want to talk about on this video and this review of Forgetting Moon is I really enjoyed Durfee's writing style. On the Elfland to Poughkeepsie scale, he's more on the Elfland side, which is what I prefer. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Ursula K. Le Guin wrote an excellent essay talking about fantasy prose. How kind of a more traditional, almost archaic kind of prose is called the Elfland, modern prose is Poughkeepsie. I will always prefer here, because I read fantasy because I like being transported to another world. I love escaping our world into this magical land that we're reading. I love the fact that it just feels different. I love being immersed in these places. And using more modern vernacular, unless it's a work of low fantasy that does have ties to our world, it always takes me out of the story. And I find the Elfland style that I feel that Durfee embraces in this book works better for fantasy tales in my mind. No offense to Brandon Sanderson, who I love, but when he uses words like awesome and things like that, it immediately pulls me from the immersion in the story. And I felt that just his prose style here worked really well to transport me to this world of the Five Isles. Now, one minor thing I will say with the prose, I felt with a couple of the characters that their dialogue felt exactly like the narrative voice. So they didn't feel like fully fleshed out characters. They felt like the same voice as the narrator. That would be a minor complaint for me, is just the dialogue didn't always feel distinct from character to character. But overall, I really like the writing style. It's rich without being dense, and it's clear without being simple, which I think are two things that personally are the kind of writing styles that I enjoy most. So in summary, Forgetting Moon is a fantastic opening book to a book series. I've not read the next two books yet. I will be reading them in the next 2 months. But if you want to hear me talk more about The Forgetting Moon, we're going to have a discussion on my channel on February 1st, 8 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to be joined by my friends that run the channels, Bards and Books, Talking Story, Go Read Books, and we're going to be just on a discussion about this book. It will start spoiler-free, so if you haven't read these, you can join us for the first part, then we'll move into spoilers. So those of you that have read, we can have some discussions. I hope you'll check us out live on that live stream so that you can contribute to the conversation. We'd love to have you there. But in summation, I really enjoyed this book. This was a great way to start the year. This was my first book of 2024, and I really look forward to reading The Blackest Heart and The Lonesome Crown in the next 2 months. So hey, if you've read The Forgetting Moon, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to talk with you about this book in the comments section below. Please label any spoilers if you do have any spoilers, and remember, I haven't read books 2 or 3 yet. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter and Goodreads. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.